This is Norman Brewster speaking.
My voice won't come up very loud because I'm back here
In the background.
Anyway, Norman, you were a CPR agent at Glacier. What is Glacier and how did it come to be? What is it to the CPR?
Well, I suppose to the CPR, first of all, it marked this. It didn't even mark the summit of the grade through the cell curves, because Rogers passed the summit. In fact, I don't know how Glacier came about, except that it was the first mountaineering center in North America, and I suppose in those days it first became a station because they needed stations simply for dispatching trains on single track. But apparently the CPR, someone in the CPR, quickly realized that people were interested in mountaineering there, because a number of Europeans came out before the CPR had constructed Glacier House, the hotel there, and began to explore the valleys, close to Glacier, like the valley of Loup Creek, the Bonnie Glacier and so on. These were amongst the first explorations, and then naturally people were interested in the glaciers that they could see from Glacier. Of course, it got its name from the Illecillewaet Glacier, and as you know from the pictures you've seen, the Illecillewaet Glacier had a grand ice fall that used to plunge down about 4,000 feet right back of where the station was and where the Glacier House was built at what, when I went there, we called the hotel grounds. It's a beautiful place. It's actually at the confluence of the valley, which begins with the Illecillewaet Glacier, and the valley of the Asalkan Glacier. They come together there at a place romantically called the Meeting of the Waters, and that's just about where the hotel grounds is and where the station was. And the track goes around there in a horseshoe curve. Now, the summit of the railway grade, of course, as you also know, was Rogers Pass. And when I came to Glacier in 1940, there was nothing at Rogers Pass except the vestiges of the old grade, which had been turned into a road by the Parks Department, Glacier being in a national park, and which went from the station of Glacier across to Stony Creek. A very good road indeed, but there was nothing else there except that old grade or road and the old ruins of an old roundhouse, and usually was a porcupine down in one of the locomotive pits or something like that. But that's about all, and there was nothing much else in Rogers Pass, as I remember it, except a few Columbia ground squirrels and the odd grizzly roaming around, and the two horses that the park warden used to have. All the park wardens get horses in, every summer for packing and so on, and our park warden, Bob Mann, used to get the same two horses back again every summer. He named them Mutt and Mitchie, and used to turn them out because he didn't use them very much on Rogers Pass just to graze. And I remember I was telling you once before that Mitchie developed a strong affinity for bears, and you had to watch him when you were riding him, because if there was a bear anywhere around, he'd pursue it. And he took off a couple of times and went down the bank with the park warden. So this is strange, because horses are notoriously afraid of bears. They can smell them a long ways away, and they get very restive. Well, Mitchie became restive, all right, but in an aggressive way. But there was one old fellow still in Glacier who used to live on Rogers Pass, and his name was Joe Butterworth, and he had been on Rogers Pass. He'd worked for the CPR for a little while, and then he became a sort of a handyman and clerk for E.A. Morris, who used to have a store up at Rogers Pass. C.D. Morris, I'm sorry, I'm mixing him up with the tobacconist in Vancouver. C.D. Morris, who was a well-known character around there, used to cash all the checks for the workers on the CPR, and of course the CPR then was very well populated, because between Revelstoke and Donald, which is on the east slope of the same hill, they had 13 miles of wooden snow sheds. And of course, to keep up 13 miles of snow sheds meant that they were working on them all the time in the summer, because every summer, of course, the whole countryside used to burn up with sparks from the engines, and lots of these snow sheds would burn, and they had multitudinous B&B gangs out fixing them all summer long, and of course they were spotted here and there. And EA used to send old Joe out with money to cash these checks, you see, and this was part of the thing, and to bring business to his store in Rogers Pass. Well, by the time I got there, EA, or CD Morris rather, had moved his business to Glacier, had sold it to some other person, and Joe had retired. He was living in a little cabin in the woods on the banks of the Illicilwa. And what the hell he lived on, I don't know. Mainly tea and toast, and whatever alcohol he managed to get, one way or another. But it seemed to be a very good diet, because old Joe lived to be about, I think it was about 87 when he died in the old man's home in Kamloops. And when he was still in his 70s, he was still around Glacier. We in fact, built a new cabin for him, because the old one, which had a dirt floor, if you can imagine, it became a little too much and leaky and everything else. So we built him a new cabin. I don't know whether that helped him any or hastened his demise. Some of these fellows get accustomed to their environment of dirt, but I think it was the alcohol that kept him going anyway. But he'd tell some stories about Rogers Pass, but none of them had very much to do with railroad. Most of them were to do with drinking, which is what Joe was chiefly interested in. One could do a sociological thesis on a guy like Joe, He'd been, anyway, I wasn't getting away from Rogers Pass, but like I was saying a while ago, Jack, for me, the railroading, I suppose, was about as romantic as railroading can be. But I never saw railroading as being very romantic. I guess I was too close to it all the time. Certainly up there it was more palatable to me than anywhere else that I'd seen it, except at field, these huge engines charging up these great big mountains all the time, Well, you had the same thing in Glacier, only I think it was a little more elegant there, because the engines were 5900 types, which are very good-looking engines and very large, largest in the country.
These what would run from Revelstoke?
These ran, in fact, right from Revelstoke to field then. And on the passenger trains, they used to run right through from Revelstoke to Calgary. And I don't know whether that was a good idea or not. I know during the time that I was there, they did throw a lot of side rods off, probably because going between field and Calgary, they got going pretty fast and probably exceeded the speed limit or something. I don't know whether this had anything to do with it or not, but I know we used to have lots of trouble with them throwing side rods once in a while. However, they were good-looking engines, and they certainly looked fine. They're coming up the Illicilwa Valley, particularly on a winter's day. They get past Ross Peak, which is 5 miles west of Glacier. Now oftentimes I used to be skiing over on the side of Mount Cheops, and if the weather was fine, and see these number 4 would get into Glacier about 10:30 in the morning, which is a good time to see it because the sun would be up then, and you'd see this train come up out of the shade of Ross Peak into the sunlight, and two of these huge engines on the front, and great plumes of white smoke, actually steam, mainly going up, and this terrific barking sound, a long, shiny train behind it. It really looked good. I mean, too bad there wasn't some photographer there, like yourself.
Well, this helper engine, would it go past Glacier? Would it go on through the tunnel, or would they?
No, no, they always cut them, going east from Revelstoke, they'd always cut the pusher off at Glacier. And he'd turn around the Y there. Incidentally, the valleys are so narrow. The valley at Glacier itself is particularly narrow, and there wasn't enough room to build a Y there without putting the tail of it in the side of the mountain, so it had to go in a little tunnel-like affair. And also, of course, at the tail of the Y, there was an avalanche used to come down once in a while, not very frequently, and cover it. And I know, not while I was there, but shortly before I came there, one of the pushers was turning around one day, and he got in the tail of the Y, and this slide came down and covered him up, and the engineer and fireman were there for a little while, before they got dug out. which wasn't an unusual circumstance around there, because in the wintertime, which I found the most exciting time of all, you were always waiting for avalanches because you knew that they were going to come sooner or later. And of course, there was this feeling of tension in the air. I used to ski to and from work, and almost everybody skied around there, except for a few more or less old fogey types who used to snowshoe. And in fact, we would be on skis from, I would say, around the first part of November until about the first week in May every year. So you get quite used to skiing. And going to and from work, when at times I was working nights there, and when it would be snowing day after day, you know, this is the funniest feeling, you know. There's absolute silence and snow drifting down very softly, and the only sounds you would hear would be a tree unloading its load of snow, you know, a balsam tree, and you'd hear this soft thud, you know, but you were always waiting for the sound of an avalanche. You know, very seldom came. Usually the slide started when you least expected them. But it did give you this feeling of tension, you know, that something was going to happen. And a rather pleasurable feeling, especially if you were in a safe place.
Well, you'd hear these avalanches when they came, though, just they came down the line, or did they?
Well, certainly you'd hear them if they happened at Glacier, but for instance, if they happened down at Ross Peak, 5 miles west of Glacier, or anywhere between Glacier and Flat Creek, which is a very prolific avalanche area, you wouldn't hear them, no. And particularly because in the wintertime, of course, they're powder snow avalanches, and they come down very fast, and they don't rumble and grumble and roar like the spring avalanches, which are full of wet snow and are often what the Germans call ground avalanches because they go right down to the ground and take rocks and everything else. But I was quite fascinated by the whole subject of snow and snowfields and avalanches while I was there, and I certainly saw some good examples of them. And in connection with the railroad, I remember one night I was working at Glacier, and there was a train out of Revelstoke. Well, it used to take the average freight, what we call a two-engine train, that's two 5900s, an hour and 50 minutes to go from Revelstoke to Glacier, which was around 40 miles. It's all 2.5% grade. Between Revelstoke and Glacier, they climb about 2,500 vertical feet. And anyway, this train was due into Glacier and didn't arrive there. So after a while, somebody called up on the track phone, and turned out that the train was between Ross Peak and Flat Creek. What had happened was one of these powder snow slides came off Ross Peak, and at that point, the track, the river, the Ilsilt River, is between Ross Peak and the track. And the slide didn't even, the snow of the slide didn't even cross the river, but the wind from the slide certainly crossed it, and with such a velocity that it overturned 2 cars in the train, which just happened to be passing by at the time. And of course, naturally, this broke up the train and stopped, and there it was. And they had to pick up the cars with auxiliary before they could, you know, clear things up.
Was this just the wind from the avalanche?
This was just the wind, yes. I went down there the next day, you know, and to take a look at it, because I knew how destructive the wind from avalanches could be. I'd seen evidences of it, you know, the trees snapped off and everything, but I just went down anyway to take a look at it. And this is quite right, there was no snow at all from the slide across on the track. It was just a blast that precedes the slide, you know. I don't understand the dynamics of it exactly, but evidently the slide coming down creates a vacuum, and of course this tends to accelerate the wind that it creates, and evidently it must get a tremendous velocity, because I think the best example I saw of it was several years later. After a long period of heavy snow, I went up in the Salcombe Valley where we used to ski very frequently, and just about a couple miles before the glacier, in the lower part of the valley, you come out in an open space which actually is swept regularly by avalanches coming off the Salcombe Ridge. And so the trees are all gone on the west side of the valley there. It's fairly wide at that particular point. But the trail used to skirt along in the trees on the eastern side. Well, when we came out that day out of the trees below that point and got to that point, you could see that some really terrific slides had come down, and there was a big new semicircle blown out of the forest there. And there were trees. I know that they were at least 1.5 feet in diameter, but just snapped right off at the snow line and thrown back. I mean, this carved out, I would say another 60, 70 feet of forest, you know, just from the blast. The snow had never even touched it.
Wind blast.
Just wind blast, yeah. And it's quite terrific, you know. I'd like to see it. I've never been close enough to see this happen to trees. You know, I've been fairly close to slides, but nothing like that. But as far as volume of snow is concerned, the most terrific avalanche I ever saw was right at Glacier. I mean, it was really on the side of Mount Avalanche, you know, and you know where that is from Glacier.
That's above the old...
Above the old track. No, it's just east of the old hotel. After the railway loops around at the old hotel grounds, then it came right back across the flank of Avalanche, which is what they call Avalanche Crest. It's really a ridge of Avalanche. And it is completely swept by avalanches, the whole darn thing. I mean, you can see it because there are very few trees growing on it. And at that, along there, in the old days, when the railway went across Rogers Pass, there used to be 2 tracks. Summer track, which was out in the open, and a non-summer or winter track, which was all enclosed by snow shed, because this thing was swept every winter, many times, by avalanches. Of course, their avalanche sheds were not as good then as Mr. Gallardi's now, and they were built of wood, not concrete. And Joe Butterworth told me that there was a shed there, I think he called it 20 shed, which used to go out every winter. And never was a winter that this shed didn't go out sometime or another. But at any event, this particular year, there wasn't too much snow, and avalanches are not connected with the depth of snowfall at all. Actually, the connection is chiefly between the weather at the moment, the sun being the prime mover of avalanches, I think, and the way the snow has fallen, the weather during the time that the snow fell, whether it fell, for instance, on top of an icy layer, or whether it cohered below, or what the temperature was, you know, and so on and so forth. This governs the structure of the snow and the layering of the snow, and in time governs how the avalanches will peel off if they come off at all. This particular winter there hadn't been very many avalanches, it hadn't been particularly heavy snow or anything, but all the snow was still hanging up on the side of Avalanche Crest, and it had been rather dull, this normal weather, and then suddenly on May the 1st turned sunny. Beautiful weather, you know. So it got quite hot, you know, and it was wonderful. You really love the sun around Glacier, because for about 3 months of the year you don't see it down the valley at all. And when it comes in the springtime, it's a very grateful thing. But on May the 1st it got sunny and warm. The second it was still sunny and warmer, and the third it was even warmer, you know. And of course I began to think, well, no, this damn thing is all going to slide at once, you see, because nothing had come down at all. And I worked from 8 till 4 that day at the station, and I kept running out on the platform, you know, looking up at the Avalanche Crest. Boy, I want to see it when it starts. Well, as luck would have it, at 4 o'clock, nothing had come down. I got out on the platform, and I thought, well, I don't know, maybe it's not going to slide. And I was looking up there, and all of a sudden I saw a little trickle of slide start right up about, I think it'd be about 8,500 feet or something like that on this ridge. And, you know, one started, and another started, and another started, and the whole damn side of the mountain just peeled off. One terrific moving mass. And it came down, and on the sides there are, you know, small trees growing up, as trees persistently will, you know, they get wiped out and they grow up again. And you could see these trees going down under the snow. And then it leaped over the cliffs at the bottom, and then came down on the old grade, and the government has a bit of a road, or the Parks Board just below it, with a tremendous thump, you know. It must have been 1,000,000 tons of snow, and you could just feel the air shaking, you know. I don't know whether the ground shook up. You know, you could feel everything shaking, just like an earthquake. It was a tremendous sight.
Well, this outside track you talked about, this was for tourists, was it? Summer track?
Yes, because the CPR, of course, had an eye to tourist business then. I mean, you know, they built the chalet at Lake Louise. Actually, this chateau at Lake Louise was built after they abandoned Glacier House. It was the result of having abandoned Glacier House after they bypassed Glacier House with the Connaught Tunnel in 1912, wasn't it?
This put the Glacier House out of business.
Put the Glacier House out of business. So they then moved their sort of alpine tourist business to Lake Louise. We'll come back to that later because it's quite interesting connection with the guides, but the summer track then, because the CPR was interested in tourist business, was built simply so that people could see the beautiful scenery, which they see now from the highway. And that's the only place I know of, right along Avalanche Crest, where there were two tracks for that reason. Now, the guides, as I said a while ago, Glacier was, I think, the first mountaineering center in North America. And the CPR, who were quite enlightened in those days, quickly realized this, and they brought out some Swiss guides from Switzerland and stationed them at Glacier. And many of them stayed there. The majority of them stayed there. Some of them went back to Switzerland and didn't return, but the majority of them actually stayed there. And as Edward Foyt's told me, Glacier in the Selkirks is much more like his own Bernese Overland than the Rockies were. They always had a soft spot in their hearts for the Selkirks. So after Glacier House was closed, following the opening of Connaught Tunnel, sometime in the early 1920s, I believe, then CPR transferred the guides to Lake Louise. And they carried on there until 1950s, I guess. And I don't know what the situation is now. I don't think the CPR has any guides now. Edward Foyt is still alive, as you know.
Well, the old grades are still visible, are they? Glacier up
Yes.
there,
So certainly they're very visible from the highway, although nobody goes slow enough to see anything, you know. And besides, there's so much to see. But you can't miss that, particularly, well, you could, as they've been used as roads from the town of Glacier around the loop of the hotel grounds. The road then followed the old summer track right across Two Rogers Pass, and the winter track was beside it. When I was up there, we used to go up and once in a while and try to rescue a few of these old squared timbers, you know, for wood, because the Parks Department wouldn't allow you to cut anything except dead trees, and around there it was quite a thing to find dead trees and get them back home. So we used to go up, as I say, and try to rescue some of these timbers, but not very many of them were good. You know, they have an outer shell that looked all right, and the inside would be rotten. But they must have been beautiful timbers in those days, you know. They were all clear, #1 Douglas fir. It makes you cry to think of the millions and millions of feet they put into those sheds, which burned down every summer or get swept out every winter. But the old, I think perhaps what would be most interesting to you, if you ever go up there, it would be a very easy thing to get on the track about 1.5 miles west of Glacier. This is the end of double track, and there's a spring switch or electric switch. There used to be an electric switch in my day that we controlled from the station in Glacier. This is the end of the double track through the Connaught Tunnel. And above there is the old loop, or the loops, which went over Loop Creek. And I think you're familiar with it. You've seen pictures of it if you haven't actually seen it. But this is quite fascinating. And if you can walk along the old grades there too, but they're pretty well grown up with poplars. And you know, it's not very open. The old bridges, the two bridges are still there across Loop Creek, or what remains of them. The place where you can see it best is from the top of Mount Abbott. The loop, part of the loop is on the flank of Mount Abbott. The other side of the loop is on the flank of Ross Peak, because Loop Creek passes between Mount Abbott and Ross Peak when it debouches into the Illicellewaet. from the top of Mount Abbott, which is a very easy climb, you go straight down on that thing. You can see these loops and they're perfect circles, you know, something that you perhaps don't realize if you're pushing your way through the bush, you know, down below. But it looks wonderful. They're very plain. You get a sort of airplane view of them. So in fact you get if you look down from almost any of the peaks there, because everything seems to be straight down. This is when you get this terrific feeling that the railway and everything in the bottom of the valley is, you know, right below you. And it's almost true. I know where this slide I was talking about came down off Ross Peak. The last year I was in Glacier, I didn't get a chance to do as much mountaineering as I wanted to, so one day early in September I thought, damn it all, I knew I was going to move by this time. I just have to go out and climb another mountain here, because I may not be back for a while. So days are short, and doesn't get light too early, so I didn't have much time. So I went and climbed Ross Peak, you know, which is just a little peak. It's only about 8,500, and it's not worth climbing from a mountaineering point of view or anything like that. And so I went by myself and walked down to the electric switch, and I took off in the bushes and bashed my way up, you know, through the bush and the forest until I got up in the rocks, and then I ran like hell, got to the top of Ross Peak, and then I started along the ridge which connects a bunch of tributary peaks to actual Ross Peak. It's all part of the same mountain, really, I suppose. And I got to a point where this slide actually starts, right directly above the railway track. And you know, right there, you're a vertical mile above the railway track. And I suppose in actual distance, you know, if you carry the horizontal line out, I'm sure it can't be a half a mile. I'm quite certain of it. I mean, it's a tremendous drop. And so it's no damn wonder these slides come down, as they do every winter. And I don't know, all these lucky fellows that have been up there working with the highways department, you know, on avalanche control. One at least, no, a couple of them I know very well, but I haven't had an opportunity to talk to them. And this is the kind of thing I would have liked to have done when I was up there. Fascinating. Yeah, galloping around in the snow and all that.
Well, I suppose 1 o'clock, we could continue this can go on.
Enthusiasm for the scent of the Selkirks, which I don't think is altogether a figment of my mind. When I first went there, about the end of June, that's the first thing I noticed when I got off the train, was there was marvelous, fruity sort of scent in the air. It seemed quite heavy, almost tropical, and wasn't quite in keeping with the, you know, the clean, rugged-looking appearance of the mountains. But there it was anyway, and I never smelled anything like that before. And of course, as you know, your sense of smell is great for evoking nostalgia. I came across the same smell here in this part of the Selkirks once or twice, and I just can't trace it down to any particular plant. It must be a plant that exists in the Selkirks, and I don't know what it is. When I was up there, you know, I used to talk to the park warden, and I told him about this, and you know how exasperating such things are. So first somebody says, well, it doesn't exist, or I've never smelled it, and then you try to describe it, and so then they attribute it to something else that you know it isn't, but you never get to the bottom of it. And I thought for quite a long time it was Labrador tea. I don't know why, except I'd seen this in Wheeler's book on the Selkirk Range, and I went around, you know, crawling around on all fours smelling things, but I still haven't discovered it. So it exists, and I wish that some botanist could tell me, you know, what it is, or but anyway, that's enough about smell, because it isn't just smell up there. Most of the beauty of Glacier in that area of the Selkirks is really visual. I mean, smell is in fact not too important there. It's most of the time it's rather aseptic, you know, as far as olfactory things are concerned. It's high, and the vegetation, well, it's luxuriant, you know. It's not very smelly, let's put it that way. And besides, when I was there, I was generally climbing and getting out in places where, you know, above timberline and so on, where there's lots of beautiful flowers, but they certainly, they're not noted for their smell anyway. But I think one of the things that we didn't talk about last time,
that you are particularly interested in is the railroading aspect of being in Glacier, which has gone now because the trains, I understand, no longer stop there, and the famous Connaught Tunnel is no longer double-track. It has been single-tracked, and trains are dispatched on single-track by remote control, centralized traffic control, as they call it. It apparently works fine, but when I was there, of course, there was double track from Connaught, the east end of the Connaught Tunnel, right through the tunnel, which is 5 miles, and then another about 2.5 miles, I think, down to the end of double track, which at which there was an electric switch, which we operated from the station. And this was a great source of agony to new operators, you know. It would keep you jumping. It had all sorts of bells and lights on it, you know, like one of these pinball machines or a one-armed bandit. It had everything except the oranges and lemons, you know, come rolling around. But one of the things, the Connaught Tunnel was a constant source of, I was going to say amusement, but it wasn't really amusement. It was a source of tension in a way because, as you know, was built because of the big slide at the western end of Rogers Pass in 1910, where 65 men, all CPR men, were killed. They were buried in the snow. And this caused the CPR to think that they better tunnel under the mountain instead of coming over it, which actually was pretty sensible. So I think they got right busy on it right away. And I think you probably know the history of the Connaught Tunnel, you know, the wonderful episode about the Scotsman who had come over from the United States. He was a real rock man. He took a contract with the CPR, which included liberal bonuses for going over a certain number of feet a day, and the CPR being utterly convinced that the rock was all Sir Donald quartzite, you know, and that would be very hard to penetrate. And of course, this canny Scot, as soon as he got inside a little ways, he ran into a lot of nice shaly stuff, and he started going like hell, you know, like a mouse burrowing through cheese or something, and he was making fabulous amounts of bonus, and so the CPR then up and canceled his contract. And I don't know how they finished it, but they did cancel his contract, and so he had to fight for his rights through the courts, and as he was fighting at CPR, he had to take it eventually right to the Privy Council, and he won. So this is a very satisfactory episode of civil rights and all that sort of thing, I guess. But anyway, they got the tunnel built, and it's quite a long time after it was built. I think it was finished about 1912. I should remember the date on the... We can check. It's on the portal of the tunnel.
Yeah.
And when I got up there, it was in 1940, quite a while later. You're still running trains through it. And this particular thing was characteristic of the tunnel, you know, what was always happening in there. In the wintertime, there's a big temperature difference between Connaught, which is virtually always in the shade of Mount McDonald, and very dank and gloomy, and the Glacier end, which does get a little bit of sunshine. It's a little more open, you know, in these deep valleys. So that in the winter, when you get a period of good weather, which isn't too common in the Selkirks, and you get some bright sunshine and cold, snappy weather, then you get air rushing from, the colder air rushing from Connaught over Rogers Pass down to Glacier. And also, because the tunnel itself is quite a big hole, and it's absolutely straight as a ruler, the air rushes right through the tunnel. Also, the tunnel ascends a little bit. It's about a 1.2% grade, I think, on the average. So this air comes rushing through there. Now, the CPR, wisely or unwisely, put their fans at the west end of the tunnel so that they have to force the air, the ventilating air, through the tunnel downwards. And when the weather is such that there's this updraft, then the smoke the steam locomotives used to plug right up in the middle of the tunnel, and it became virtually solid. Well, the trains going through it, you know, laboring their way up this 1.2% grade and throwing out vast clouds of smoke and steam and so on, which gathered in the tunnel. caused a lot of condensation, and this stuff would all fall down on the rails, and of course it'd make the rails slippery. Well, in order to keep their footing, they would pour on the sand, you know, which all engines have, and they'd sand the rails. And then, of course, after they passed over it, the sand would be all ground up into a nice fine mush, mixed up with all the rest of the slimy stuff. And it was pretty darn slippery, and the result was that trains going through there westbound up the grade would oftentimes find themselves slipping. If they didn't have enough power to keep up enough momentum, they'd start to slip. Then they'd have to shut off, and they'd be stuck in the tunnel. Sometimes they were stuck there for quite a long time, and I remember one occasion when a trainman got off the caboose. His train just couldn't get going, and he sort of felt his way along the train up towards the head end. Before he got there, the engineer backed up on the slack and pulled forward. He managed to get the thing moving again. Well, the trainman couldn't see a damn thing even with his lantern. He could hardly see his lantern in front of his face. It was so smoky, so he just had to stand there until the train went by and resign himself to walking out. But unfortunately, after the train went by, somehow he lost his sense of direction, and he walked out the other direction. He phoned me up from Connaught, you know. After he got out of the tunnel, he knew where he was, of course, but there he was. He was 5 miles away in the wrong direction, and he'd walked every step of it, the poor guy.
So, I guess.
Yeah, but this is the example I was really thinking of was one morning when they had this updraft condition, and I'd come to work at 8 o'clock. A westbound drag had just gone through, a long train with 2 engines, and he cut his beaver mouth pusher off at Glacier, went around the Y and turned around and gone back. And number 1, the passenger train, which was due at Glacier at 6:40 in the morning, was running about a couple of hours late. Just after I came to work, number 1, the indicator, the block signal indicator showed number 1 was in the tunnel. As a matter of fact, we used to call the tunnel the hole. You know, it doesn't sound very graceful, but we'd say as soon as they hit the indicator, well, we would tell the train dispatcher there's a train in the hole. And of course that indicated what we meant to convey. So number 1 hit the hole, and the roadmaster, Charlie Swanson, was a very nice guy, but nervous as hell, you know. He was a very small fellow, and I don't know whether that had anything to do with it or not, but Charlie was jumpy, you know. He stood in great awe of the CPR, and he hated to see anything go wrong. He was waiting for this train. He was going to go down to Revelstoke on it. So he's sitting around the office, and I was feeling in a particularly jovial, malevolent mood, so I said to Charlie, you know, it'd be a hell of a joke if the damn train never got out of the hole, wouldn't it? And Charlie, of course, he really took this to heart, you know, and he wagged his head very seriously and nodded and looked very grave. Well, ordinarily, number 1 would have taken... He cut his pusher off at Stony Creek this particular day. You know, sometimes, depending on the tonnage, how many cars are on the train, they'd either take the pusher right through, or they'd cut it off at Stony Creek, and it would back down the hill because, as I say, the Connaught Tunnel is 1.2 grade. The rest of the hill from Beavermouth up to Connaught is 2.2. So, on this occasion, he'd cut his pusher off, thinking, the dispatcher figuring that the train was light enough to go through itself. Unfortunately, there was a lot of smoke in there. This other freight train had just gone through. There was an updraft. The fans were still working against the updraft, and this tunnel was just plugged solid with smoke. And number 1 got in there and started to slip. And he should have been through in, at the most 12, 15 minutes. Well, 15 minutes later, I said to Charlie with great joy, well, he isn't coming yet, Charlie, you know. And so he says, don't you think you better tell the dispatcher? And I said, oh, you know, maybe he's just slipping a little bit. So 20 minutes later, I told the dispatcher, number 1 was still in the hole. You know, there's nothing he could do about it anyway. And 30 minutes later, it was still in the hole. So everybody started getting a little worried. So I called up the fan house at the west portal of the tunnel, and I said, could you look in the tunnel and see if you can see light or anything? So he reported back and said they couldn't see anything but smoke, which, you know, that was easy to figure. Well, an hour later, conductor finally called up on one of the phones. And incidentally, there are 9 phones in the tunnel in little niches in the concrete lining of the tunnel. So he'd finally got to one of these phones, and he called up and he said that they were stuck in the tunnel. Fortunately, one of the pushers off the drag that had preceded number 1 was still in Glacier, because I wouldn't clear him. When number 1 was a little late, I was suspicious, so I said, well, you'd better stay here. So we had this engine there, and after talking over the dispatcher, we still had the conductor number 1 on the phone. We couldn't do this by train orders, but we just made arrangements between the conductor of number 1, myself, and the engineer on this pusher. But he went down the eastbound track, which is the left-hand track in the tunnel. As the rule is, keep to the left in that tunnel, and went down to Connaught, crossed over. There's a crossover between the 2 double tracks there, and backed up through the tunnel and all this smoke, and backed on to this train, the passenger train, and pulled it out, all except the engine, to Connaught. This took him a long, long time, because when he was backing up onto the rear end of number 1, of course, he couldn't see 6 inches ahead of him. I don't know just how he did it. It took him, I think it must have been at least an hour to go a couple of miles, maybe more. But he finally made it, and it was, I think, fairly precarious. You know, you can imagine a great big engine backing up in total darkness and trying to contact a train without killing somebody. But he did it anyway, and we got the train back to Connaught, and then we brought it back up the other track, because what had happened actually was this. The train, number 1 got in the tunnel with 1 engine, and the engineer was a little guy called Jean Lassard. He wasn't a bad engineer. He wasn't the best one in the world either, I guess, but, you know, just like the rest of us, he was an average guy. He got, let's say about halfway through the tunnel, and he started slipping. So evidently when you start slipping, you shut off the throttle a little bit, you know, and he shut off the throttle, and then he opened up again, he shut off again, and then he let it at a fairly low speed, and he thought that the train was going, but the train was standing right there, and he didn't know it. There was so much smoke and everything, and the drivers were turning round and round. The train was standing in the same spot, and pretty soon the engine embedded itself in the rails. It wore these big 130-pound rails, which are about a foot high, as you know, right down through the ball or head of the rail, right down into what they call the web, or the thin part. Fantastic, because have you ever seen those rails? They're
not the big ones.
No, but you haven't seen the rails that were worn down like that.
No.
I mean, they cut them out of there, and they're sort of a museum piece now. It's too bad we haven't got them for your museum. But it's really fantastic. These drivers had just, in a few minutes, had worn them right down practically to the bottom. And of course then, obviously, they couldn't get out of there. They were stuck. By the time Gene realized that he wasn't going but standing still and shut off altogether, well, there he was. So, as I say, the first thing to do was to pull the train back to where it came from and come up the other track, and then later on to rescue the engine. But it was quite a lengthy procedure. But it really sounds fantastic to think that, you know, the engineer, he's driving his train and gaily driving it along as he thought, and it's standing still all the time. However, that's the Connaught Tunnel for you. There are all sorts of wonderful things going on there.
Did you say those rails are preserved?
Yes. I don't know who's got them, but they are. They're. I know that they were cut out of there, and probably Revelstoke got them first, but I'm sure, you know, some CPR person must have them. I wish I could have got a hold of one, you know. I've never heard of such a thing before, although I suppose it must have happened elsewhere. But I don't care much for tunnels or subterranean things. As a matter of fact, suffering from claustrophobia a little bit. Anyone who does care for them, though, Glacier is quite a nice place, because they have Nakamu Caves, you know, which is, I suppose it must be the most extensive limestone caves in the country, isn't it? Didn't you? Honestly? Oh, I thought everybody knew about it. Oh, well, I tend to dismiss them as being unimportant, but you know, there are a lot of people who think that caves are important, and they are quite a phenomenon. It occurs in nature elsewhere, but these ones are a particularly good example of a limestone cave. They're about, I'd say about 3 miles from Glacier, and end of the upper Cougar Valley between Mount Cougar and Mount Cheops. They were discovered by an old trapper type who lived around Glacier called Dutchman. I suppose it's Deutschman actually, but he discovered them. And in the early years of the century, they were quite a tourist attraction. The Parks Board developed them, and they even built a great log tea house up. No, the CPR built this tea house, I think, yes. And the Parks Board used to have a couple of men stationed up there in a little subsidiary chalet-type house, because there were many people. And these are the days of the old Glacier house when the CPR had been going around Rogers Pass, and they had their hotel there. But the caves were surveyed by Mr. Wheeler, and there's several miles of passages. But he says, I think in his book, I think he mentions them, and so does Elizabeth Parker in her little book on the Selkirks, that while they were surveyed, they were not completely explored. There are many passages that have never been explored. So they're quite extensive. Quite hair-raising to me, because I don't care for caves and such things. The upper Cougar Valley above them is the most beautiful alpine valley, and a botanical friend of mine told me years ago that there are more varieties of alpine flowers in the upper Cougar Valley than in any other place in British Columbia. And he had been around the Garibaldi area too, which is noted for its flowers and so on. In this beautiful valley with all its flowers, and a carpet of flowers in the summer and fall, there's a beautiful little brook. There's quite a lot of water in it, but it just sparkles and bubbles and bounces between banks of heather and flowers, and it's very gay and makes you feel good. And then it comes down to the lower end of the valley, and all of a sudden it just glides almost silently into this tremendous smooth limestone hole and disappears from sight into these caves. And this brook, and also another brook that comes from Blue Pass, both enter the caves and both run through it. And you can hear water rushing almost anywhere in the caves. It's usually, you don't see it, it's way below you or something, because the whole mountain evidently is honeycombed with openings in the limestone. So much for the caves.
Well, just to keep things more or less on the track, I want to talk
Yeah.
Selkirks too.
Yeah.
But could we get back to the railroading for a minute?
Sure.
Try and straighten this up. Actually, what was your job at Glacier?
Oh, well, when I went there first, I was third trick operator, which means, as far as railways are concerned, third trick is 24 o'clock or midnight to 8 o'clock in the morning. And that's when I went there, that was my job. I had already bid on it. I owned the job. I went there, found out there was no place to live for my wife and my newly born child, and so eventually I lived underneath the store. The local storekeeper, Charlie Hopkins, and his wife ran the store and the post office, and there were quarters underneath that he used to rent to mountaineers who came there in the summer. Many people who remembered Glacier in the old Glacier House days used to come back, and it was well known all over the mountaineering world, and lots of people really loved Glacier, and they used to come back every summer. I think Hopkins used to accommodate up to about 12 people, and they would board them too, and it used to be lots of fun. So not having a place to live, when I first came there, I boarded with Hopkins. My wife stayed in Vancouver for a while, and as I say, it was at the end of June. A number of people were still there, and I had a wonderful time because it was a sort of holiday atmosphere, you see, mountaineers, and I was interested in mountaineering. That's where I stayed, and I used to run up and down the mountains all day long, and then go to work at midnight and work till 8 o'clock in the morning, and then come home and have breakfast and go out climbing again. This is until I couldn't stand anymore. Then I'd have to have some sleep once in a while. But the atmosphere is exhilarating, and sleep isn't too important when you're young anyway.
Well, then, what would your actual duties be?
Actually, copying train orders. There were, at that time, it was very busy, and they used these 5900 engines, these huge engines, and freight train out of Revelstoke always used to come out of Revelstoke with one 5900 road engine, as we call it, and one 5900 pusher, which, while called a pusher, was actually pulling because it was on the head end. And he'd have a pusher from Revelstoke to Glacier, which is roughly 40 miles, during which you elevate yourself from, what is it, about 1,200 and something feet up to 3,800 feet, which is a big climb. And so they puffed pretty hard all the way up. And at Glacier, the trains always stopped. Every train stopped at Glacier, and the conductor booked in, as we call it, in a train register, and they cut the pusher off the head end, which then went around the Y, and then back to Revelstoke. Sometimes there'd be another pusher there, and they would couple up and go back as a single train or something like that. But you can imagine, I mean, this is the way it is in the days of steam locomotives, when every unit had to be a separate train and run by a engineman. It was quite a dispatching problem because this increased the number of your trains. You see, every pusher was a train and had to meet and pass other trains and so on. So your side tracks, your passing tracks all the way between Revelstoke and Glacier would be pretty busy. And this meant a hell of a lot of train orders. What would happen was third trick was never as busy as first trick as far as train orders are concerned, for various reasons. One of them actually at the time being that on the third trick there was a dispatcher named George Davidson, G-A-D. He probably the best train dispatcher the world has ever seen. And he described himself as the laziest man on the Revelstoke division, which may or may not have been true. But what he meant was that he didn't do any unnecessary work. What he did was wonderful, you know. It was just, I don't know what kind of an analogy there is for a guy like that, but he was right on top of everything, you know. He was always a step ahead of everything, no matter what happened, even when the whole railway turned upside down, you know, and engines fell off the track and so on. Well, George was exactly the same as ever, which meant that he was crabby as hell, growling, swearing, cursing, but never making a false move. And for a newcomer, it would be rather frightening, you know. And there were some operators that were scared stiff of him because he always acted like a bear with a sore ass. But he was wonderful to work with. After I got off third trick, I finally got on second trick because of various reasons. It's a little more civilized. You know, there's no particular social life there anyway, but you get a chance to climb mountains and be at home in the daytime with another dispatcher. And I used to implore the third trick operator quite frequently to trade tricks with me so I could go back and work with Davidson just to refresh myself, because after working with a dispatcher like that, you know, you hate to work with an ordinary clunk.
So he would handle all train movements from
Yes.
Revelstoke.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, see, essentially, on that mountain subdivision, we used to put out an awful lot of straight meet orders. This is like number one engine so-and-so, meet number two engine so-and-so at Illecillewaet. That's a straight meet. Or number one engine so-and-so, meet first number two engine so-and-so at Illecillewaet, and second number two engine so-and-so at Ross Peak, you know. These are straight meet orders, very simple and all that sort of thing, but their very simplicity means that they're dynamite, you know. I mean, there's no leeway. You meet there and you meet there, and that's all there is to it. Well, then the other thing was, dispatching trains, you have time orders. There are trains on the timetable which are scheduled, you know, and at every station they have a leaving time. Well, then an inferior train has to keep out of their way, and he's working his way against an opposing inferior train. He just goes to the furthest station he can and to clear the time of this train. Well, then this results in orders such as number 951, run 2 hours and 40 minutes late, field to Lencoil, 2 hours and 30 minutes late, Lencoil to Golden, and so on and so on. This, in other words, this gives the other trains time on that scheduled train. Otherwise, they'd be out there waiting in the weeds, you know, and the train would be 2 hours late. Well, this is what the dispatcher does, and when it's busy like that, on a busy single-track railroad, the dispatcher is putting out orders all the time. I mean, at Glacier, what we would be doing most of the time, particularly with time orders, we'd be copying orders which the dispatcher would put out to Field, to Lencurl, to Golden, to Beavermouth, to Sturdy, which was later moved to Stony Creek, to Glacier, to Albert Canyon, and to Revelstoke. But we all copy them simultaneously. Then we repeat them back in that tobacco auctioneer sing-song repetitive stuff, you know, which sounds incomprehensible to a person who's never done it, but actually is very exact, you know, and very essential, so that every word is there, every figure is there, nothing is left out. Everybody is supposed to check everybody else, so that nothing ever happens. Two trains don't come together going in two different directions on the main line. So that's what I did. I mean, the thing was, it was kind of exciting, especially working with a dispatcher like Davidson. These trains, well, he could make them do what he wanted to do. He was a good psychologist. I mean, he had all the engineers striving like hell to make one station beyond where they would make for any other train dispatcher. You see, he'd suck them along by giving them a little time on a passenger train. In those days, passenger trains were still considered to be important. And there were standing instructions that you were not to put out time on a passenger train. That means to say if the passenger train was running on time, you couldn't put out an order saying that he would have to wait at a certain station for 10 minutes for an opposing freight train. But old George did that all the time, and he got away with it. Because what would happen, the engineers would make sure that they would get there in time to clear number one or whatever opposing train it was, so that he would get out of the station without having to wait this 10 minutes, you see. The very fact that he put this wait out and said, wait 10 minutes at this station, this gave the freight train the full 10 minutes. And he would make that station for number one, let him go, and nobody would be held up. But it was strictly against the rules.
The passenger trains were supreme.
Yes, the passenger trains were supreme, that's right. They still were. Everything else had to keep out of their way, and of course, the passenger trains on single-track railroading always were a damned headache. I mean, because they're faster, and because they're superior, everybody has to keep out of the way, and because they're faster, besides having to meet opposing freight trains, they overtake freight trains in the same direction. And this is an awful waste of time. Traditionally, operating railroaders hate passenger trains, you know, unless probably in places where the passenger trains were, well, the prime consideration. I guess that was the case in the early days of railroading. But always in my memory on the CPR, all the operating people had to pay so much deference to passenger trains, and they're such a goddamn nuisance, you know. And, I mean, if it could just run freight trains, it's much better. Well, now the CPR has reached that sort of nirvana. They got nothing much left but freight trains, so presumably they're happier now.
How many trains would you have, say, running between Revelstoke and Glacier at any one time?
I never thought of it that way. First, when I think of it in another way, we would have, on the average, fill up a page and a half of that train register every day, which would mean about around 40, 45 trains a day in and out of Glacier, you know.
All on single track?
All on single track. That's a lot. Another way of putting it is the signal maintainer used to come out of Revelstoke, and he would have to come up to Glacier sometimes. We had a signal maintainer and a helper at Glacier, but sometimes the man at Revelstoke would come up there, or the roadmaster, or anybody else on one of these track motor cars. Now, the only way that they could get out of Revelstoke was to park right on the tail end of a freight or passenger train and stay about 25 to 40 feet behind him all the way, because every siding switch that they passed on the way between Revelstoke and Glacier would have a trainman standing in it waiting to let his train out of that siding onto the main line to go to the next station. And if the motor car was too far behind, well, damn it all, he was out of luck. He'd just have to jump off, and throw his motor car off in the weeds, you know, and then he was, in fact, it was so bad. I remember one time a new roadmaster came out from the prairies somewhere, and a fellow named Yorston He started out from Revelstoke one morning with a section foreman as a helper. And most roadmasters went by themselves, but he got the section foreman because he was new. And he started at 8 o'clock in the morning, and 5 o'clock at night he called me up. I was on duty at Glacier, and he was at Ross Peak, about 5 miles away from Glacier, and he said he'd taken all day to get there, and he said he was going to stay there that night. He just couldn't make it. There were too many trains.